Hi, my name is Glenn Deason. I'm a professor of Russian politics and Eurasian integration. Today is Tuesday, the 1st of August, and with me today is Colonel Douglas macgregor, a man with great insight from his high-ranking position in the US Army, battlefield experience, many books on military strategy, and of course, political experience from Washington. Welcome back, Colonel. It's great to see you again.
Thanks.
So you recently published an article, a very good article, called Discarding Illusions, Ending Wars. Not just an interesting topic, but very relevant, as some might say it appears we're reaching the beginning of the end of this horrific war, which shouldn't have happened. But I wanted to delve into some of your arguments, even if you agree with that assessment, of course. So I thought today we can just discuss how you see that this has started, where the war is going, and lastly, how you think this will likely end. But starting at the beginning, obviously to end the war, it's necessary to be honest about why the war began. In these days, that seems to be controversial, but without addressing the cause, of course, we can't really understand the motivations of the counterpart, but also we miss the possible solutions for a settlement. So to start with a very big opening question, how did we end up in this war, fighting the world's largest nuclear power? How did we end up here?
Well, I think there are several different answers on different levels. On one level, it's very obvious that over the last 15 to 20 years, every attempt by Mr. Putin as president of Russia and his government to convey their concern to NATO, to the United States, about the gradual but relentless movement of NATO's eastern border to the border with Russia were ignored. All these pleas for a halt, requests for discussions, requests to re-examine arrangements on the European continent for national security that would address Russian concerns and potentially even include Russia as part of the larger solution in the regional security structure. All of these things were frankly ignored. And at the same time, you had people lying directly to President Putin. We know that now from both the former German Chancellor Angela Merkel as well as President Macron, that the Minsk process, which was supposed to address the concerns Moscow had for the welfare and rights of Russians inside Ukraine, were simply instruments or modalities designed to slow down any solution, but to pacify Russia and at the same time to buy time for this fledgling Ukrainian state that emerges after the 2014 Maidan coup, a radical nationalist state, to build itself up into a regional military power. Those things are the principal reasons for the frustration on the Russian side and the decision reached ultimately in January to use military power to signal primarily Russia's concerns. And I think that's the other portion of this that deserves some attention. I think Mr. Putin is a victim of what we call rational choice theory. Rational choice theory has been very popular for years because people think that other people are rational. And if you're rational, you are inevitably going to pursue your own individual interest. This is true in economics. People think it's true in political life. It's true in almost everything, except that it's not true. People are not rational. They frequently do things that are not in their interest. They make decisions on the basis of emotion, not reason. And I think when Mr. Putin first went in with this relatively small force, he had a little over 200,000 men available, but he only sent 90,000 in initially along a very broad front. His thinking was, well, this will signal the seriousness with which we in Moscow regard the potential for Ukraine to become part of the NATO alliance and become a base for a potential attack against Russia. And he thought, I think, without giving it much consideration, that since certainly the Second World War, we have always approached the Soviet Union and subsequently Russia with a great deal of caution and circumspection, because Russia is a nuclear power and the Soviet Union was a nuclear power. And there was an understanding in Moscow and in Washington that whatever disputes emerged, every effort should be undertaken to avoid an escalation that might lead to a nuclear exchange. So I think he thought, well, once they see how serious we are, they'll immediately say, look, this has gone far enough. We really do need to talk. And I think he completely misread the West. He should have paid attention to the various proposals that were submitted in December and January, which were never really seriously considered. We essentially told Moscow, Ukraine joins NATO, it's our way or the highway. So if you don't like it, you can lump it. And obviously that was unacceptable. So he takes this small force into Ukraine and he gives it instructions. He says, I don't want to kill Ukrainians. I want to minimize losses. He didn't even allow the Russian forces to attack the Ukrainian forces in their respective bases. He said, oh, no. He said, I don't want this to become a full-blown war. What I want to do is signal how seriously we're taking this matter. And I want to minimize collateral damage. I don't want to injure innocent people. I don't want to destroy buildings and structures that don't require attention from the military. Well, we know this failed miserably. And in fact, the worst possible outcome occurred once the talks did get started between the Ukrainians and Moscow. We intervened and made it very clear that we didn't want a settlement. This was, of course, the famous visit of Boris Johnson at the behest of President Biden to Kyiv, in which he says, what are you doing? Don't accept neutrality. Don't accept anything. Reject everything. And we promise you that we will provide you with all the scientific, industrial, military power that you need to prevail over the Russians. The Russians are weak. The Russians are stupid. The Russians lack resources. The Russians have a weak economy. Remember the battle cry in Washington, Russia is a gas station with nuclear weapons. The Russians have to do what we want them to do. So don't worry about this. Zelensky obviously bought the argument. But the fundamental point that was not clear to Mr. Putin is that his assumptions about our behavior in the past could not inform him about the present, because in the past, large numbers of the people who today express hatred and hostility for Russia actually regarded the Soviet Union as somewhat misguided, but ultimately on the right track to a Marxist utopia. Those people now are violently anti-Russian because Russia is a national state with a national language, a national culture, and it rests on the foundation of Russian identity and Orthodox Christianity. These things, of course, are anathema to the globalists who are currently governing the United States and governing you, most of you in Europe, particularly in Western Europe. Remember, you and we have now managed to open our borders, admit millions and millions of people who are not Europeans, people who have not come to assimilate, who can't assimilate, who in fact are coming increasingly to assimilate us. So I think you put these things together and you have an insoluble dilemma for Mr. Putin. There is nothing Mr. Putin can do short of commit suicide, which involves resigning from office, opening his borders, and allowing the United States and its Western allies to strip Russia of its resources and essentially govern it. He's not going to do that. So he's now in this unfortunate position of having to fight a war he never really wanted to fight. And even to this point, he's exercised enormous restraint. I don't think he or his generals ever thought that the Ukrainians would be foolish and stupid enough to launch endless counterattacks against their defenses in the south, which he's now annexed because it's populated with Russians, and it is historically Russian territory. But it's happened, and Ukraine is now prostrate. Its losses are horrific. Their hospitals are full. We think the Ukrainians have lost somewhere between 300,000 and 350,000 soldiers killed. Just within the last month, we think the Ukrainians have lost 30,000 killed. I mean, these are ridiculous numbers. This is World War I quality killing on an industrial scale. The Russians, on the other hand, contrary to popular belief, have taken very light losses, perhaps 30 or 40,000 KIA and another 30 or 40,000 wounded, most of whom were returned to duty. They did not end up leaving the war zone permanently, which has been the case for most of the severely wounded Ukrainians. But none of this has made any difference, Glenn, to people in Washington or Brussels. It may not make any difference to anybody in Oslo or Stockholm or Copenhagen or maybe Berlin, maybe Paris. Why? Because there is this exercise in self-delusion, widely reinforced by the media, that the Russians are losing, the Ukrainians are winning, and that Ukraine will ultimately win provided we just give them more things. And of course, this is emboldening the Poles, the Lithuanians, who have an agenda of their own, divorced from NATO, to aggrandize themselves with territory at Ukraine's expense.
I was curious about the wider conflict because what has to be stated is obviously that Russia considers NATO expansion into Ukraine to be an existential threat. Now, this seems to be quite important because if we accept this, that Russia sees this as an existential threat, then I don't understand what the thinking is, because if we would defeat the Russians, then this would likely end in nuclear war. And on the other hand, if we don't think we can defeat them, well, what would be the purpose given? And also, why did you go to this extent when we knew that this would happen? I know that the narrative doesn't really permit this at the moment, but again, it's worth remembering that even Bill Clinton in January of '94, he argued that NATO expansion could redivide the continent. His Secretary of Defense, William Perry, he argues he considered quitting in opposition to NATO expansion because it was so dangerous. And what was very shocking to me is he argues all his colleagues in the Clinton administration agreed that NATO expansionism would create conflict with Russia, but in his words, they didn't care because Russia was weak. We don't have to do anything. They will adjust. And this was, the leading politicians and the military in the United States, who many argued this. I mean, at the moment, it seems like a marginal argument far out on the fringes, but this was the argument of Jack Matlock, who negotiated an end to the Cold War. George Kennan, who set up this, infrastructure of the Cold War. William Burns, the CIA director, famously said in 2008, the NATO expansion would trigger civil war and a Russian invasion of Ukraine, which they didn't want, but they would feel they had to do. And even Angela Merkel said that in 2008, she didn't want to give NATO membership to Ukraine because Russia would consider it a declaration of war. This is a very strong statement, yet today, this is something you're not allowed to say, that the Russians consider this an existential threat. So, but what is the thinking though in places like Washington or Brussels, for that sake? Well, why were they willing to take it to this extent when they must have known that this would happen?
Well, there are two things that are at work here. One is you have the truth, which you've enumerated with great success. You've outlined the truth very well for the audience. But then you have the narrative. And the narrative, as you know, is diametrically opposed to the truth. Well, if you can suppress the truth, people are likely to believe the narrative. And so the narrative has gained great currency in the West. Now, more and more people who are remotely interested in what's happening in Ukraine are figuring this out. I think the tide is turning in Germany and Austria. It certainly turned in Hungary early. Even in Poland, the public opinion is turning against Polish intervention in the war that Ukraine is fighting. Whether or not that makes any difference to the government is an open question. But I think the Polish population says, help Ukraine, but let's not join the fight. Certainly France, Italy, Spain, I think the populations there are equally opposed to any direct military intervention. If you were to ask Americans, I think they would also say, we don't support any use of American military power against the Russians in Ukraine. The problem is that the elites who truly believe they can destroy Russia are unwilling to state publicly that their original assumptions were wrong. They assumed that Russia was weak and economically vulnerable. Russia was not weak. Obviously, it's not economically vulnerable, not certainly on the scale of, say, Germany or the United States to these things. But then I think you've got the problem politically here in the United States that the war they're waging against the Russian state and the Russian people is a war they're waging here against their own people. In other words, these people who want to destroy Russia's national identity, open its borders, change its national culture, or eradicate it, are trying to do that here in the United States. I leave it to you to determine what's being done in Europe, but my impression is in France and Germany, for instance, the populations there are turning very negatively against their governments because they see the same effort underway in those countries. In other words, what is wrong with being who we are? What is wrong with the fact that we are a product of Western Christian culture and civilization for the last 2,000 years? Well, there's nothing wrong with that. Why are we defaming it? Why are we destroying it? Well, that's what the elites want. They've adopted this globalist position that is very reminiscent of what the Soviet Union tried to do. You'll recall that when the Soviet Union collapsed, one of the jokes in Moscow was, look around and identify all the Soviet men that are out there. Your audience may not realize, but one of the goals of the original Communist Party of the Soviet Union was to create what they called the Soviet man, who was a man without identity, who was a man with no detectable center of gravity. He embraced all the Marxist, Leninist values and was fungible material to be utilized and exploited by the state as they wished. Well, that failed. And so the joke was, where are all the Soviet men? Well, there are no Soviet men, but there are Ukrainians and Russians and Lithuanians and Latvians, Estonians and Finns and Uzbeks and Tartars and so forth and so on. Well, I think this is the problem in the West right now. We have people with a similar agenda. They're trying to homogenize all of us in the West into some amorphous mass without any detectable identity, without any values, certainly values that have any connection to religion or Christianity. And this is not working. It's failing here in the United States. It's promoting conflict and division. It's failing in its war against Russia for the same reason. In fact, Russia today is far more cohesive as a society than I would argue the United States or anyone in Western Europe. Russia has really profited internally from the war in the sense that the nation is very, very united. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone loves Vladimir Putin, that there are no Russians who want changes in Russia over time. In fact, I think the war in Russia has actually promoted democratization in many ways inside Russia. But Russia is united on the point that they will not be dictated to. They will not allow themselves to become what France and Germany, Great Britain, and the United States have become, essentially putty in the hands of the globalists. So at the same time, Putin is also waging war on the financial or economic level himself. And one of the reasons that he's so popular, or his government is so popular in places like Africa and Latin America and Asia, is because they share his views. They too want to survive. They want sovereign states and countries. They want their way of life, their identities, their cultures to survive, and they don't want to be bullied by us. And we've bullied a lot of people for many decades because of our financial system, our financial hegemony. And we've dominated them to the point where you can't get a loan out of the World Bank if the United States objects to it. You can't grow the crops that you want to grow, or the World Bank will not fund you unless you do what we tell you to do effectively. And that's, the SWIFT system, the dollar hegemony, all of these things are part of the war that now is being waged. So I think what we're seeing more and more is that Europe and the United States are lumped together on some island, and the rest of the world is saying, stay there and stay away from us. We don't want to do business with you anymore. Now, this is not all going to happen overnight. You're not going to see the dollar vanish or the reserve currency change immediately. But given the economic trials that I think lie ahead, it's going to be very difficult for the United States to maintain its financial dominance. its military dominance is already very much in question. All you have to do is look at the last 20 years of these misguided interventions and the unfortunate circumstances surrounding our eventual departure. So I think the Russians, the Chinese, and the Indians in particular all see themselves in a very powerful position. We are deluding ourselves into thinking that since we are, for ideological reasons, right, and everyone else is wrong, that we can still triumph. But that's not going to work. The bubble in Washington is going to burst. The bubble at home and the bubble overseas.
Well, I'm seeing the economic trends. I couldn't agree more. And I'm reminded of when the United States were trying to reduce its dependence on Britain in the beginning of the 1800s with the American system, when you have, your manufacturing industry, transportation corridors, and of course a national bank, because I think this is intensified to such a great extent now as a result of this war, in which you see not just the Russians and Chinese, but across the board, we're seeking technological and industrial decoupling from the US, developing new transportation corridors which are reliable, by also be decoupling from US, and of course the financial pillar, which would be the banks, the currency, the payment system away from SWIFT. So it's quite extraordinary. I think it took many by surprise how much it has intensified. But I wanted to switch quickly over to where we're currently in this war now, because there's a lot of developments. And what are the major developments which people should have noticed, and what do you expect will happen in the following weeks?
Well, remember that Ukraine has always been mired in corruption on a scale that most of us in the West cannot even begin to imagine. A friend of mine just returned from Mexico who's also spent time in Ukraine. And he said, this is going to sound terrible, but he said, I think Ukraine is more corrupt than Mexico. And of course, Mexico is effectively an organized crime state. So that's pretty bad. I think that's one dimension of the Ukraine problem right now. The other is, of course, the simple mass deaths that have occurred on the battlefield. You can look at this on satellite, and you can see thousands of dead Ukrainian soldiers lying on the field that aren't recovered. You have Ukrainian units, platoon company size, maybe larger, I don't know, but certainly platoon and company size, that made the decision to surrender to the Russians. They're fed up with the way they've been mismanaged, fed up with the abuse that they've taken from Kyiv. They've died in great numbers. They don't see any point in it. They're being asked to sacrifice themselves repeatedly for no tangible gain. And the worst part is that they can't even successfully evacuate many of their severely wounded. So in many cases, Ukrainian commanders have contacted Russian commanders and said, I've got wounded here. I can't evacuate them, so I'm going to surrender because I want them to live. The Russians have always treated the surrendering Ukrainians well, and the Ukrainians know that. So as a result, I think you're going to see more and more surrenders. I think you're going to see more and more desertions. And at some point, the military is going to completely fragment and collapse. I don't know precisely when that will occur, but I don't think it's far off. Any military establishment, regardless of how brave, courageous, and disciplined the soldiers may be, after enough time under fire without result, without any tangible gain, begins to not just become demoralized, but question the rationale for the whole war. That happened to Russia in World War I. It happened to the Germans shortly before the end of the First World War. People finally say, enough. We can't go on. I think we're getting close to that in Ukraine. Even the foreign soldiers that have been fighting very hard on behalf of Ukraine are largely gone now. They've packed up and left. I think the Poles are the only ones left. And I'm told they're down to a few thousand. So I think we are now approaching what I consider to be the most dangerous point in the entire conflict. And the point I'm trying to make is Ukraine is on the verge of collapse. The Russians have not yet launched an all-out assault. Yes, they've launched an offensive in the northeastern portion of eastern Ukraine, and that is moving along well. And most of the Ukrainian forces are either being swept aside or melting away. That will continue, and I suspect that part of that will turn north to encircle Kharkov, and another part will continue towards Slovyansk and other territories behind Ukrainian lines. But the all-out assault that is waiting to happen has not yet been launched. And I think it will come when it becomes clear that we are not going to negotiate an end to this. On the contrary, I think there are people now considering seriously the use of NATO forces in Western Ukraine. And I think the Poles are leading this effort. It's why I talk about the Polish tail wagging the American dog. People in Washington are just effusive in their praise of the Poles. Oh, the Poles are wonderful. The Poles are great. They're the staunchest supporters of the war. We don't like those Germans. Those Germans don't like this war. Those Germans like Russians. They're bad. This kind of nonsense. I think we're in a lot of danger from Poland, from the Polish leadership and potentially the leadership in Lithuania, that they may actually send their forces into Western Ukraine. Remember that the so-called Ukrainian Galicia was part of Poland for many, many centuries. Of course, that is, you've got to go back to the 18th century before, until 1794 to show that. But after 1794, there was briefly between 1918 and 1939 a restoration of Polish control of some of that territory, as well as territory in Belarusia. And the Ukrainians know that, the Poles know it, the Lithuanians know it, and so do the Russians and Belarusians. And right now, Lukashenko is more than a little concerned about any attempt that the Poles and Lithuanians might make to regain control of, for instance, Minsk. There used to be a giant monolith. I don't know if it's still there or not in Minsk. And when I say monolith, a stone tablet, if you will, that stood a couple of meters high at the entrance to Minsk on the east side of Minsk. And it said in three languages, I think Lithuanian, Polish, and Russian, "Here begins Lithuania." And there are lots of Lithuanians that regard these areas as theirs, just as the Poles regard much of Western Ukraine as theirs. In fact, the Poles controlled everything out to Kiev for a few hundred years. None of this has anything to do with NATO. And it's something that no one in Washington thoroughly understands or grasps. In fact, what people say in Washington, well, if that contributes to the ruin of Russia, well, then that's a good thing. Let the Poles go. They don't understand that if the Poles and Lithuanians do take a hand and go into Western Ukraine, that could regionalize the war, because they'll be up against not just Russia, but also Belarusia. And the Russians then will no longer have much incentive to exercise restraint. And there's nothing in Western Europe, particularly in Poland or Germany, militarily, that the Russians cannot reach and destroy.
No, I think the Russians have seen this as a challenge, given that they now have Wagner's in Belarus and also sent nuclear weapons to Belarus. So I think they're trying to hedge against this prospect of the war spreading. Well, I guess I share your concern about the escalation of the conflict, because initially we were told even sending tanks would be too much of a dangerous escalation. Yet this is a long time ago. We crossed this line, long distance weapons, many other red lines we weren't supposed to cross. Now we're sending depleted uranium ammunition, cluster ammunition, possibly F-16. So it feels like we'll keep looking for these silver bullets, something, a game changer, something that can turn the tide. But if you're correct now, and Ukraine is moving towards collapse, there must be immense pressure on how NATO will keep the war going or prevent defeat. But at the moment, it doesn't seem there's anything else besides a direct intervention. So, of course, Western Ukraine is a possibility, but I also heard a lot of chatter lately about the Black Sea, providing these convoys for Ukrainian grain, which would be a way for NATO to get involved directly into this war. I just do you see I'm thinking more the Black Sea option now. Do you think this is something that will be pursued
Well, keep in mind that President Biden just signed an executive order that directed that U.S. soldiers on the ground in Ukraine be paid hazard pay, in other words, combat pay. Well, he's been telling us that there are no U.S. soldiers on the ground in Western Ukraine. Well, we know that's not true, just as we know there are many soldiers from many NATO nations on the ground in Western Ukraine. It's a very dangerous thing, though, to signal this publicly and make this public statement, because it conveys the impression to Moscow that we're actually contemplating intervention there. My concern with the Polish and Lithuanian connection is that if they go in there, they will be attacked. Putin has made that very clear. He said, well, yes, if they come into Western Ukraine, they will never leave. We will make sure they never leave. In other words, they'll be buried there. Well, I think the Poles and Ukrainians mistakenly believe that if that happens, that we will then send our forces in to help them. Now, maybe someone in Washington is prepared to do that I don't know. I know that the senior military leadership in Washington is very fearful of that. But it may be that the political leaders in Washington don't think that's the risky alternative to watching Ukraine collapse. They may say, well, if we don't go in some fashion to help the Poles, our credibility will be completely gone. NATO will collapse. And that takes us back to your opening question. What about NATO over the long run? And I think NATO's doomed, because NATO consists of 32 nations now? Every nation has a different set of interests. Not all of those nations see the world through the same lens as people in Washington and Brussels and in Berlin or Oslo. In other words, the world looks very different depending upon where you stand. And trying to drag NATO into this could absolutely end it quickly. And I don't think Washington believes that. I think, again, they look at the sheepish behavior of the ruling elites in Europe and say, well, these people have no choice, but they have to go along with this anyway. Well, perhaps that's true for the globalists that are running your countries, but that's not necessarily true for the people that live in Europe. And I think the European electorates see things differently. In other words, I don't have crystal clear picture of what is going to happen. What I do know is that officers who've sat in on meetings and tried to explain the true situation and point to the dramatic increase in Russian military power and the excellent performance of Russian forces are not welcome as discussants in these meetings. If you want to be on the inside, if you want to be with the four stars and the politicians, you have to talk about, oh, these Ukrainians are going to win. These Russians are just stupid. They can't do anything right. And if they come up against NATO forces, they're doomed. Well, that's a lot of nonsense to make those kinds of statements, but that's more popular than I think is healthy for our governments right now.
But you mentioned before that the Russians haven't had their major offensive yet. And I was curious why we haven't seen it, because, well, I do understand it's a war of attrition and it shouldn't merely be measured in territory, but also loss of troops. But on the other hand, we see that the Russians have mobilized hundreds of thousands of soldiers. They're armed to the teeth. And on the other side, we see that they have degraded the Ukrainian military to a great extent, even emptied NATO's weapon storages, by which we are now admitting as well. So as a military man and a scholar in this, why do you think Russia hasn't gone for these big arrows yet?
I think that President Putin remains cautious because he does not want to precipitate a direct confrontation with NATO and the United States. That's always been his top concern. But I think he's got plenty of senior officers who are telling him, look, if we continue to wait this way, people will misinterpret our restraint for weakness, and they will think that they can exploit this weakness. And I think the senior officers in the senior ranks of the Russian military who are saying that are correct. You cannot win any war by sitting on the defensive. It can't be done. You can kill almost everybody in front of you, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you can win. And I think increasingly the view in the senior ranks of the Russian side is that until we're moving down the main streets of Kiev and our forces have crossed the Dnieper River, no one is going to believe the war is really over. In other words, they won't believe that we've won it. I think there's a lot of truth to that. So the danger right now is too much Russian restraint. And if it continues, I think it will invite Polish and Lithuanian intervention. And then that is Pandora's box. God help all of us. The consequences of that are profound.
I heard this argument from people such as Michael McFaul suggesting that if America only steps up and enters, then the Russians would be too fearful and bow down. And this is also something I heard from Moscow, which is that they have two risks. One, yes, if they hit back, they risk war with NATO. On the other hand, the risk of not hitting back is becoming much greater because as they see, the emboldens the adversary to think in the ways that McFaul is thinking, that if they only roll across the border, then they would run away. So for them, it seems to be a bit of a dilemma. Avoiding big war, but on the other hand, don't have this restraint misunderstood as a weakness.
Well, remember the Russians have also, and I think Putin deserves a lot of credit for this, have also been very sensitive to the opinions of people in the global South, not just China and India, but also the global South. And he has not wanted them to think that he was someone who would dismiss the humanitarian dimensions of the war, and he hasn't. In other words, he's tried to make it very clear that his approach to this whole thing is more defensive than offensive, that this is something Russia doesn't want, has never really wanted, and is doing because it had no alternative. But at the same time, this is interpreted in the West as weakness. And I think the Russians know that. And I have a feeling that they're waiting to see what the Poles and Lithuanians do. And if they're foolish enough to intervene, I suspect at that point, the great avalanche of Russian military power will fall on Ukraine and potentially Poland and Lithuania. Because if they think they're going to be treated with immunity, that's not going to work. If they go into Ukraine, their countries let's put it this way, it will be open season on them for the Russians.
Well, let's say, be optimistic that we all decide after 1.5 years of this horrible war that we have to pursue a political settlement. Well, at this point, what do you think it could look like? I know, previously neutrality would have been enough, but after 1.5 years of this fighting, the Russians not going to give up any of the territory. So what could be a possible agreement look like, do you think? What concessions would be able to get from the Russians, and what would NATO and Ukraine be willing to give?
Well, first of all, the Russians don't want Western Ukraine. They don't want to annex areas that are fundamentally Ukrainian. They've never made that statement. They've always wanted to avoid that. They're not fools. They know that's sort of like putting a poison apple in your basket and then subsequently trying to eat it. They're not interested in that. I think if you sat down with them, they would tell you that what they have right now, which is historically Russian and is where the Russian population largely lives, they're going to retain. The question is, what do you do with Odessa and what do you do with Kharkov? I think Odessa is going to be a tough one because terrible things were done to Russian citizens in Odessa in 2014, as you know. But even more important, Odessa has been used over the last year plus as a point from which you could unload weapons and equipment for the Ukrainian military from empty ships that then picked up grain and went to sea. The Russians said no more. And they will not tolerate any control by the United States and its allies of anything in the Black Sea. So if we go into the Black Sea with any ships from the U.S. Navy or Royal Navy, which I think would be lunacy, frankly, they'll sink them without hesitation. So no, I think that's the real conundrum. You hold what you've got, and then the question is, what happens with Kharkov and Odessa? There could be some inventive solutions applied to Odessa, that it's fully demilitarized. It sort of ends up in a status very similar to Danzig as a free city. Who knows? Kharkov's another question. Maybe the Russians don't want it simply because they say, well, even though it was Russian speaking, they may not really want the bill for rebuilding it. I don't know. We don't know until you sit down and talk with the Russians. But on the Ukrainian side, whatever remains of Ukraine has to be neutral. There's no question about that. There can be no NATO presence east of the Polish border. Anyone who tries to establish that will end up at war with Russia. That's clear, that's unambiguous, that's not up for negotiation. But again, if you look back at the United States and the way we've handled these things in the past, I don't think you're going to get a good outcome of any kind. I mean, if you go back and look at Vietnam, it was very clear that we lost in Vietnam, not because we were necessarily defeated systematically on the battlefield. We never had a strategy. We had no attainable, realistic military or political goals in that country. We finally decided that it wasn't worth the expense, either in treasure or blood. And so we decided to get out. Then we went through this elaborate procedure after 1968 involving negotiations in Paris and back and forth to Washington and Saigon to try and come up with a solution that would allow us to leave with dignity. In other words, we could say we were not defeated, and now the new government of Vietnam is on its own. Well, how did that work out? Didn't work out very well for the people in South Vietnam, but we got out. The question is, how does President Biden and his administration and all the various players who are advocates for war in the Senate and the House, how do they organize our disengagement? Right now, they don't think they have to do that. They think they can continue to go on as they have. And I don't think they can. But that's what they believe. When they discover this won't work and the Russians are serious and will cross the Dnieper River, what do we do at that point? Our track record suggests we don't do anything. We pretend it didn't happen. We declare it as being over, any number of things. But you're not going to get the globalists who are in charge in Paris, Berlin, London, Washington to stand up and do a mea culpa. Oh, I'm sorry, I was wrong. Oh, we made a mistake. No, they're not going to do it. They're much more concerned about their political futures than they are about the lives of Ukrainians. You know, look at the complaint that's registered. There was an article that came out in the Daily Telegraph from one of the globalist frontmen, Richard Kemp. He's a well-known mouthpiece for the status quo. And Kemp says, the problem with Ukraine is Ukrainians aren't killing enough Russians. Well, that sounds to me as though we are preparing to gradually get out and blame whatever didn't work on the Ukrainians. I'm sure that will be tried. I just don't think it'll work very well.
Okay, well, it's a sad note to finish on, but well, thank you so much for your time. I do appreciate it. And again, the media is not doing a very great job on presenting an open marketplace for ideas in this war. So I do appreciate your perspective. Thanks again, Colonel.
Yeah, thank you, Glenn. Good luck.